Hello and welcome back, wonderful humans. It's Mr. Hesser here to talk about the day one of the science curriculum that our district sent home, which is all about food chains and food webs and ecosystems. So let's dive right in. An ecosystem is a biological community where different organisms, which are living things, interact with each other as well as their physical environment. So things like the water and the rocks. So, in science, ecosystems have to do with these living things interacting with other living things and physical environment. A simple way of looking at this relationship is a food chain. A food chain shows the path of energy from one living thing to another. So here you have a plant. The energy from that plant goes to the insect that eats it. The energy from that insect goes to the mouse that eats the insect. And then the owl comes around and eats the mouse. So the mouse's energy goes to the owl. You can see this very clear linear relationship of how the energy is moving. But it is important to know that not 100% of the energy gets transferred each time. In fact, actually, it's usually more like 10% of the energy moves on to the next level. So of all of the energy the plant has, only about 10% of it gets used by the insect. And that mouse that eats the insect is only going to get 10% of that. So then the owl that eats the mouse is only going to get 10% of that. That's not a lot of energy. So what do you think that owl, thinking about what the owl eating those mice, how many mice is that owl going to have to eat if it's going to get the same amount of energy as that initial plant had? A lot. That's typically why we see things like carnivores have to eat so much food because the energy that they're getting from what they eat isn't a lot. That's also why you'll hear people a lot of times, push you to eat your fruits and vegetables because vegetables are a really great way to get a lot of those nutrients directly. Here's a sample of a food web in a pond ecosystem. So you can see here you've got algae at the lowest level. So algae and waterweed, these are things that are producers. They're essentially using external energy sources to produce their own food. Then you have consumers, things like some fish or prawns, even some insects who are going to eat those producers. So you can see those arrows go from the algae to the prawn or from the algae to the carp, which shows you that energy is moving from the algae to that first consumer. You'll also see that there are additional arrows pointing from those consumers to other organisms, which means that the energy continues to transfer as they're eaten. So if a kingfisher, that bird there you see, if it eats a trout and that trout got its energy from the prawn and that prawn got its energy from the algae. So even though that kingfisher bird isn't eating the algae, it's getting some of that energy. It's important to note that some energy gets lost at every level here. So only about 10% of the energy gets passed from the algae to the prawn. 10% of that gets transferred to the trout. 10% of that goes on to the kingfisher. So you lose some energy each time, which is why those consumers at the top level, like the snake and the frog and the kingfisher, they have to eat a lot of food if they want to make sure they have enough energy. For today's assignment, what you're going to be asked to do is to create a food chain and a food web for a specific ecosystem. So as you're creating your own ecosystem, you can either look outside your window and look at the different plants and animals that are outside and kind of give your best guess as to what you think eats what. Or you could go online and look up an actual ecosystem that exists and see how that relationship works between those organisms. The other thing you'll be asked to do is to create a paragraph kind of briefly explaining how energy is transferred in your ecosystem. So what is producing the energy? So think about what plants are found in your ecosystem. What's producing the energy? What eats those plants? And how energy moves as different things eat each other. When you finish writing your paragraph and drawing your food web, go ahead and send it to your advisory teacher. I look forward to seeing some pictures myself. Make good life choices.